I'll never forget the day I read a book. It was contagious, 70 pages. There were pictures here and there, so it wasn't hard to bear. The day I read a book.
Okay, welcome everybody to December's discussion of our Wafer-Thin Book of the month, which is Silvina Ocampo's The Promise, which was published posthumously. And we'll talk about that, but let's start by going around and, what have you been reading lately that's been good, that you want to share with folks? James?
Shall I go? Yeah, I'll say I can
James,
go
you're
first.
always the treasure trove, so.
Well, I've got a few this time. First is Faraway, the Southern Sky by Joseph Andras. I don't actually know how it's pronounced. It's it's only about 80 pages, but he's quite a political novelist. He's published by Verso, and this one is about it's probably more a book you'd probably say is more fascinating than completely successful in itself. It's a kind of novelized search for Ho Chi Minh when he was living in Paris in the 20s as what was the name he was under then? He had apparently Ho Chi Minh during his life had more than 100 different pseudonyms at various times that he wrote under and lived under. Yes, I can't find his name now at the time, but yes. Well, I actually really like I didn't realize the portrait on the front. He actually is Ho Chi Minh. It's an amazing photo. But so it's sort of just like wandering through the areas he lived in and sort of finding evidence of essays he wrote and the political fights he got in, and it's also quite instructive in that when you see his demands in the 20s against the French government, how reasonable and calm they were, and of course going completely unanswered, what that led to, quite useful study, and maybe just give people what they want, and what they want isn't very much. The next is Like a Barbie.
Can I ask a question? Is it true that he basically was a busboy in a Paris kitchen, quite a famous Paris?
Yeah, among other things too. He lived a lot of sort of odd jobs and odd lives while he was there, and lived in a lot of different places. So it's quite, as I say, it's quite fascinating. The fictionalized structure of it doesn't quite gel. It's a bit like Laurent's Binet book HHhH about the Czech assassination of was it Heydrich in Prague, which again, it's kind of fictionalizes the author doing his research and wandering around, but this doesn't work quite as well, I think. But it's still, just because of what it's about, it's just fascinating. But yeah, the next is Park Min-jung's Like a Barbie. It's one of those little Strangers Press sort of novella chapbooks. And again, this is a fairly not grim but depressing kind of look at male-female relationships in Korea and kind of male obsession with women online and that sort of thing. But yeah, very interesting. This actually was a bit of a disappointment. I got a Kristóf's I Don't Care. It's of her, a translation of her kind of selection of her own short stories that she made towards the end of her life. It has some very good stuff in it, but a lot of stuff, considering how good her other books are, there's a lot of stuff in here that you kind of think, you thought that was worth publishing? It's a bit odd. I don't know whether it's just very short fiction isn't her, because their stories are, mostly 2 or 3 or 4 pages.
Right.
But they have a bit of the, I don't know, the kind of twist in the tail, old style magazine type fiction. They're not quite as rich or as interesting as you might expect.
What time frame were they originally published in?
Well, it doesn't actually say, but they seem to have been, I think it's a selection from sort of throughout her career, just of her very short works. But it's odd because there are some things in here that I know have been published as poems, and here they're published as prose. And I don't know if she rewrote them or if just the translator published it as a prose piece because they didn't translate poetry. I'm not sure. There's not really any information that comes with it as to how it was selected or done, so it's a bit mysterious. But so yeah, interesting but unsatisfying. And the last one's actually 2 short books that were published together or republished together.
Oh
by, John Llewelyn Rhys, who his stuff's been out of print until recently for years, even though there was that prize in his name that went for 60 odd years to a lot of very good books. But yeah, this is by Handheld Press,
right.
who published a lot of sort of early mid 20th century writers. England is my village.
They have stopped. So
have they?
Yeah, Kate MacDonald, who ran Handheld Press, has wrapped it up. She and her husband have moved away from Bath, and I think she feels like she wants to do her own work as a writer, and I think she discovered that publishing that kind of book, despite the fact she did a superb job and definitely developed a followership, it just wasn't a money-making proposition.
No, that's a real shame because they published a lot of really interesting stuff. So, I did not know that, and I'm disappointed. But yeah.
So if you have any out there that you want to get, I think they are still doing, maybe for a brief time. They may have stopped, but they are selling out their inventory.
Yeah, well, there are a few I want to get, so I'll be grabbing them.
Get your orders in if there's anything
you
want from them.
But this was promising. They also he published I think only 3 books or 3 fiction books in his lifetime. The other one by him they also put out. But this is England is My Village, which is a short collection of short stories, and The World Owes Me a Living is a short novel. And yes, they're both. I mean, he was a pilot. He was killed in World War II in a crash, and I think it was the nature of the job. But knowing that when you read these, they feel quite prophetic because there are a lot of people being killed in crashes in these. They're all about aviation and early World War II fighting. And the novel The World Owes Me a Living is about a man working in a kind of basically they used to have those tiny little planes that would take people out for joyrides at carnivals and things. So he just sort of travels around England and takes people out for joyrides in these rickety old planes in the 30s. So just fascinating kind of look at a life that really has gone now. The World War II aviation stories in England is My Village are slightly more familiar just because that kind of world has been written about more. But a very interesting writer, very good. It reminded me as a kind of forerunner of, I don't know if people have read Derek Robinson, who wrote a lot of very good books about aviation.
Piece of Cake, is that?
Yeah, that's right. Piece of Cake and books like that. These very sort of darkly comic, quite cynical books, that kind of undermine all the heroism of the sort of air forces in both world wars. So it felt like a forerunner to that. But anyway, they're the short ones I've done this month.
Okay, well, thank you. Audrey, Gordon, any ones you want to share today?
I've got one that was totally not wafer thin, but I was on a read the world challenge, and one of the countries suggested was Lebanon. So I read Elias Khoury's Broken Mirrors Sinocol, and it's a beautifully done book, 500 pages, from a nice edition from Archipelago. But it beautifully weaves in people's stories. So you start with sort of the tale of the 2 brothers and their father, and then from the one brother you weave this in, and they meet this person, and you hear a person in this person's story. They take it for a while. It's hard to do that well, and he did do it very, very well. And then the other one I finished up the year with takes place in Venezuela because that was the challenge, and it was called It Could Be Night in Caracas by Karina, Sainz, Borgo. Is a bit longer than Wafer-Thin, 220, but not much more than that. And just really tough, that period in Venezuela where it was just close to lawless. The government was corrupt, the rebels were corrupt, there were guerrilla people going through, cutting off aid things and selling them. And then so she takes a drastic decision at a certain point to assume someone else's identity who's died and escapes to Spain. So, but really well done. I recommend that one as well.
Of course, Venezuela is going through different sorts of problems now.
So I guess the one I was mentioning, which is not a novella, but they're not that long either. I'm assuming you would have noticed that the English comic writer David Lodge passed away a few days ago.
Just a couple of days ago, yes.
And my Fiona, my wife, is quite a fan of his work, in particular the Campus trilogy, because until she came to Australia after we were married, she spent most of her adult life in Birmingham, so very familiar. So for our last book club book last year, she chose Nice Work, which is the final of the Campus trilogy.
Right.
And yes, it was interesting for me because having an idea of the that difference in Birmingham with the sort of, which is now well and truly declined now the industry, but there's still the remnants of it there. And but in particular for Fiona, her late first husband, Peter, actually worked for a engineering company that wasn't that far removed from what Pringles were, which is the company in the story. But it's that sort of, and also that sense of it's probably set 2/3 of the way through the Thatcher era, and the impact of the policies then in terms of education and industry were really beginning to show. And he was, by chance, he was really one of the first writers to show what was happening and how much things had changed, but weren't going to go back either. So
that was published.
Sorry,
was that published in the late 80s as well? I think
early 80s, 82 or 3. I think.
Yeah.
I know. The name Lucy Trelaw, that she posted something about David Lodge, and that her father was a lecturer at Melbourne University, and just saying that Morris Zapp was one of the characters, that there was more than a few at the university in his time that was there. Okay. Yeah. And one of our other book club members was actually at Melbourne Uni, probably very late 60s, early 70s, because Michelle's into her 70s now, and she more or less said the same thing.
Right. What were the other two? Was it Eating People Is Wrong and The History Man? Changing Places.
Changing Places, and I've forgotten the middle one.
Small World?
Yeah.
Small World might be the middle one, yes.
I don't usually say much in these, but David Lodge is one of my favorite authors. I've read all of his fiction and his 3 memoirs. I read the fiction when they came out, except for his earliest ones. I read them later because I wasn't, reading much then. And I don't know how dated they are right now, but I just loved them when they came out. And I knew he was old and was gonna die eventually here. But the New York Times had a really nice long obituary about him, and it was actually on the front page of it was the first section of the Sunday New York Times. So he got a very nice send off from.
There's quite a good tribute by Jonathan Coe in The Guardian as well. And obviously some of his early novels were also set in Birmingham, but a very different, I suppose, not dissimilar with the industry in terms of car industry, but in the school, just slightly different as well. And it was quite a good piece. And I'm trying to remember, someone else had one, but I cannot remember her name.
Right. I think I read Changing Places was late 70s when it came out, because I was still in university. And I think in that there's a scene where they start a contest among the faculty about what classic you haven't read. And one of the professors says, well, I've actually never read anything by Shakespeare. Shakespeare, and he ends up getting fired.
Right. That was quoted. That was mentioned in the New York Times obituary.
Was it? Oh
Yeah.
yeah. I remember I was reading that. I was doing a senior paper, and I asked my own professor about, would that sort of thing happen? And he said, we wouldn't dare. No one would take a risk. So, I mean, it's a shame, but yeah, wonderful books. And I've always liked, they're kind of like the really good comic novels, which they're funny, but they're also so accurate in terms of just, they're real, they're believable. They're not just lampoons of the subjects.
Yeah, they're not like sort of a Tom Sharp book or something. Yeah.
At the other extreme.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I don't have as many things because I actually signed up to a project and I have to keep it under wraps, but I'm working with Slightly Foxed Books in the UK, and I any day now have to turn in an introduction for a book that they're going to reissue next year. And so I read the woman's oeuvre, so to speak. It's all memoirs, but a wonderful comic writer. And actually, one of her statements, quotes, which I will probably get incorrect because I didn't write it down, but she said, I take an extra long time because I'm writing comedy. And it's important that you don't include unnecessary information when you're writing a comic piece. Which is, I'm not sure I completely agree. I think excess prose can have a very good place in a comic novel, but these are all memoirs. But anyway, so the ones that I read, well, I actually went back and read Nabokov's first couple of novels because they're so short. So Mary and the Eye, which I actually I love just that whole expat scene in Berlin. I don't know, I just find it fascinating that the Russian cultures came together there, and he had such a good feel for what Berlin is like if you've ever, I mean, not that I was there in the 20s, but as a city, it has a certain feel to it, which is quite different from, say, Paris or London. Another one I started because I thought, well, this will be fun, because I knew the name for I don't know how long, but it's Bubu of Montparnasse by, I think it's Charles Philippe. And so I thought it would be a comic, little lighthearted thing, like Bubu Saved from Drowning, the Jean Renoir film. It's horrifying. Do not read it unless you want to enjoy life before antibiotics.
Oh.
So it's about a pimp. Bubu is a pimp, and it's about his main prostitute in Paris and how everybody has syphilis. And not just has syphilis, but has progressive effects of syphilis. So let's just say it takes a lot of the romantic shine off of Paris in the 19th century. But it's short. It is short. It's only like 125 pages long. The other one, which I had great hopes for, and I feel like the writer owes my time back to me, was a book called The Long Swim, which is about an American merchant seaman who is at a port in Italy, and he decides he's going to swim to one of the islands kind of in the Elba group, which is like 6 miles offshore. And it turns out to be a horrible mistake. And he basically spends like 2.5 days swimming first as a challenge to do it, and then finally to stay alive. But of course, he has to reflect on his life. So there's sort of parallels with The Promise in a way, but it's the difference between doing it well and doing it poorly. And I would have to say it was not. It was a fictional experiment, and I'm, not all experiments succeed. I mean, that's the nature of experimentation. I mean, it's good that people try, but in this case, The Long Swim was not one that I would recommend to anybody. But it's long out of print, and no one will ever bring it back. I'm sure. So let's talk about The Promise, which I'm going to save my reservation, my reservations. I'm already broadcasting there. I would like to hear what other folks thought about this.
I admired it. It was unusual, and as someone teased you before, it's an example of like your man overboard. Someone falls off a ship, and then the ship moves on. They're going to die. So it's an ideal way to have a story where you think about your life, you think about things in your life, you keep your spirits up to the extent you hope for rescue. There's definitely some points where there's some hallucination going on. There's a raft that appears. The raft has fruits on it and foods, but these are foods we've seen before. There's repetition, but it's carefully done. It looks like it's polished. I mean, I wouldn't say she obsessed with it over the time, but finding out the biographical information that she was suffering from dementia at the end, there's some parallels there. A husband who, from his very beginning, was unfaithful, bears some similarities to the Leandro character.
Right.
It was cool for me the way things went in and out. We'd start in Leandro's head, and then the narrator's head, and then Irene's head. And if that's not done well, you're super confused or irritated. But for me, it was done very well.
Yeah, I think I have to. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I agree with what Audrey was saying. In fact, because the first time I read it, because this is my second reading, the first time I read it was as an arc that had no kind of context with it other than that it was just a posthumous book. So I actually enjoyed it more this time because I actually was able to read the introduction, because that wasn't included in the text I originally had. And the stuff, about the dementia that she was facing as she finished the book up after, working on it for many years, actually made things click into place more for me on the second reading than on my first. But the first I found it a little bit, I don't know, maybe distancing, some of the stylistic choices, but knowing that real world information, as I say, things clicked into place for me on the second reading that hadn't the first time around, and I actually liked it quite a bit more. And as Audrey says, I think it was that particular fact, knowing the kind of the neurological trials that Ocampo was facing in real life, and how she kind of filtered them into the book, and that, as the reality comes and goes and what she's facing out on the water, it worked a lot more for me this time.
Right. Gordon, your thoughts?
I did like it, and I guess dementia is something that's come into my family now, and my father's probably a bit beyond the early stages. But there's that sense of what you remember, but again, you remember things long ago, but not now. But also, what are you remembering? Is it something else intruding? With sudden, as it progressed, you had the thoughts which appear to be from other people coming in to the story, because memory plays tricks. And again, Audrey mentioned about the hallucinations, that they seemed to get worse as it went along. And also, it's interesting that it started off with very short vignettes, and they started getting longer as it progressed as well. And that, I guess, the period as the period of time evolved, but you don't really know how long that was, whether it was a day or a couple of days, or how long can you actually stay afloat, and I guess dependent on the conditions of the water. And at one point, was she a mermaid, or sort of little things like that was sort of as it progressed. And it is one, as James said, I would certainly want to spend time reading again to sort of learn a little bit more. But even just the thing that ability to observe people and describe them, and the little nuances, and I guess little things like women fall in love with their eyes closed, whereas men are open, and they're little. And you're thinking back to when the book was written, you tend not to. And there was a lot in there. I was thinking it would, even for the time, would have still been quite. For that to have been originally published in Argentina, and probably you trying to guess whether that was early 70s. It would have been quite strongly Catholic then, and there's a lot of themes in there that wouldn't have been appreciated.
Yeah.
I thought this was published posthumously.
Yes, but when she was writing it, though.
Oh, when she was
yes, it started 60s,
writing it over
finished
several
70s
decades, I guess, which I find,
yeah.
you know, that immediately brings the question to me, because she was a poet, does that mean that she was working over each line with the care of a poet? Or was she struggling? Because this is her longest work, and her other short stories are really short for the most part. I mean, a 2-page story, a 3-page story is not out of the norm for the rest of her work. And some of them are 1-page little fable things. And so I started, you know, is it that she was daunted by the structural aspects of what am I putting together here, and where does it go, and how do I put these pieces together? Was it because it was too personal? Because there were a couple of things I noticed. Number one, in looking at Silvina Ocampo's biography, her second story collection was called Autobiography of Irene in translation. And it immediately like, was that like an early version of the Irene character in this book? And another, at points reading it a second time, I had the question, which, I mean, for one thing, there's a way you can read this and say the narrator, the author, is essentially absent throughout the whole book in terms of the lives she describes. I mean, she might be standing next to her brother at the fruit stand, but she's just not involved. But the second time I read it, I kept wondering, is she Gabriella? Because there are several times when it goes from a third person to first person, and she starts talking about the Gabriella experiences. So I feel like that might have been what she was struggling with, which is what am I doing here? And I have to think that given where it was, we are seeing an incomplete or an unfinished work, I think. An interesting unfinished work. To me, I feel like there are, and it's not just, okay, in modernism, there's lots of things you can get away with, but I don't think it's just deliberate disconnects. I think there are disconnects there that reflect an unfinished work, in my opinion, anyway.
It's interesting because a lot of posthumously published unfinished stuff, you're right, it it's unfinished because it gets to chapter 7 and the story is half told and then it ends.
Right.
Whereas the book is all there, but you're right, that doesn't necessarily mean that every section of it is worked over to its final form. So yeah, it could well be.
Yeah, I mean,
or if it's really supposed to be kind of reflective of where her life is at any point, or she's adding to it or thinking about it. She's adding to it over the course of 25 years.
Very possible that it was a work in progress
right,
for a very long time, and she kept, taking things out, putting them back in, trying this,
and using them cannibalizing it for Irene, having the person in their intro, which I read a little bit earlier, and so we forget the pieces of it. But we're talking about where stories appeared or stories were related to the other stories. And then maybe you get to the point where it's not really an end. I mean, it does just sort of stop, but we really can't see the person drown because that sort of takes us totally out of it. And there's something that says they're like, I'm not going to be able to write this manuscript. And then that's like almost speaking to us at that point. So
yeah, but I still found that narratively satisfying as an ending. But as I say, partly that was knowing what she was facing in reality of, everything falling away, all her memories falling away, her personality falling away. And so that felt fitting, as I say, in a way that didn't click for me when I didn't know any of that reading it the first time.
Yeah, I think that's, it's useful to know that. And I guess one of the signs that it's a work of some merit is the fact that we can speculate in this way and find substance in the book to, rather than, well, it's a bunch of pieces, but they don't add up. I wouldn't say that. You can see it. I could read this as she falls off the ship and she drowns right away. And this is all sort of, the transitional thoughts, literally the last second where you relive your life, so to speak, as the cliche has it, that, in your dying moment, your life flashes before your eyes. It can be that, it can be the fact that as she was aging, she less and less knew what her destination was going to be, except it was going to be dark and like going to the bottom of the sea. I think also one of the things that intrigued me was the fact that I was never quite clear what was, memories from, I guess, Sicily, because she mentions Palermo explicitly, and what was her life in Argentina, and she's gone over to South Africa, but she's coming back. So, the sequence and where these characters fit. Clearly, she talks about Gabriella waiting for Irene in the plaza, which means it has to be Buenos Aires. And she talks about characters, the man she sees at the beach, the tailor who is at the beach, but she knows him from the tailor. That's all Argentina. But then there are other things that earlier on in her life, I guess, reflect what she knew in Sicily.
It's interesting too, because I read a lot of her short stories, and also some of the books she wrote with her husband. And yeah, it's interesting because I wonder how they worked together, because he wrote a number of novels. So it's interesting, someone who works on a very small scale and someone who works usually on a much bigger scale. It'll be very interesting to know how they wrote together.
Right. Although I don't think any of his novels are very long. The Adventure of Morel is...
That's true. That's quite short. Actually, you may be right. You're looking at them.
Pages.
Yeah, that's true. They're all quite thin.
Of course, I don't know how much of his opus has been, or oeuvre has been translated into English.
Yeah. And of course, I guess he wrote a lot of short stories too, because him and Borges and, that whole focus on short, fantastic or peculiar fiction, they were all very interested in the collections they put together too. So
the Wikipedia on her, I thought, was pretty thorough. It's not always as thorough as you'd like it to be for women writers, but I think somebody went through and beefed it up, or someone was quite a fan, and people are studying her now. But it's interesting that an early piece that was autobiographical was published in Sur, which is the publication that her sister Victoria Ocampo and Borges put out. And then the sister was critical of it because she just thought she was telling tales out of school. And I thought, way to smack down your little sister. She's the youngest sister and the oldest sister. So that would have been an interesting dynamic working together.
Family dynamics. God love them.
And of course, Borges was full of praise for her. Like, you can read so much where he raves about her as, one of the greatest writers alive and things like that. So that would have added an extra bit of complexity to it all.
Yeah, I mean, I gather in Argentina, she's far more highly regarded as a poet. And I guess there is a collection of her poetry from New York Review Books. But I haven't read it, unfortunately, so I can't. I often find that poetry in translation, it's difficult to feel that you're not kind of getting at it, at a distance from the real sense of the language in many cases. I mean, some poets translate amazingly well, but so it's hard to know what, I mean, there are people who rhapsodize about certain Latin American poets. And, you don't necessarily see that in the translated version of their poetry, I don't think.
Yeah, I'd like to find that collection and read it, actually. But yeah, I have never seen it anywhere.
Yeah, it's one of, they put out really nice little paperback collections of, I mean, they've got a very rich poetry catalog, which doesn't get a lot of notice. But they're all like, there's sort of like a riff on the classics, in the sense that each book is the cover is one color.
Yeah.
And each book has this, a different Pantone.
Yeah, no art on them.
Yeah. And it's very simple. I mean, there's no graphics. It's just the name of the poetry collection and the poets, and maybe the translator's name, and then a little blurb on the back. And I mean, I think they're smaller than this, actually, which is the US edition of The Promise. So they're nice little, I have probably about a dozen of them. Some interesting poets there. But I don't have hers, so I can't speak. I don't know if has anybody else tried her poetry.
No.
No, not me either.
I would be interested to try to tackle it maybe in Spanish. I'm not by any means totally fluent, but with a dictionary and my decent Spanish, if the poetry is sort of spare enough or there's any simplicity to it, I probably could handle it. So that gives me a thought of trying to get it in Spanish.
It's hard to imagine that she would be a poet of complex.
If they're similar to the vignettes
Diction.
and character sketches, if there's certain spareness to them,
yeah,
I think I can handle it. So I'll put that on my list too. I'll report back by Blue Sky at some point.
Okay. Well, I think unless there are other thoughts or comments, questions that folks want to ask about The Promise, I think this was one of your suggestions, James, and it was something I felt I could sink my teeth into, definitely, because it was worth a second read. And to me, that alone says a lot for a book, because there's a lot of books that are not worth a second read in.
Yeah, actually, that's one thing I've enjoyed about doing this year, because I think the only book I hadn't read before was Waiting, the one we did last month. I think all the other ones for me were rereads, and I really enjoyed doing that, because in no cases have I thought, oh crap, this has not stood up to what was in my memory, and in fact in several cases, like this one and the Michael Frayn. I've actually enjoyed them a lot more the second time. So yeah, it's been a really worthwhile experience.
Well, I have to say, I was just thinking, of the 12 that we read, my absolute favorite has to be the one that I thought I was going to hate just from the cover, which was The Endless Summer.
Oh yes,
Adam Nielsen. I thought that book was so good.
Unusual,
Yeah,
definitely. And the author is quite a character, so I was
yes.
glad to be introduced both to her and the work, though. Yeah, and when I do book discussion stuff, I read differently than if I'm just sort of sailing through something. I read with a little more deliberation. At some point, well, you know, what would I say about this? And so I always get a lot out of it, even if I don't like the book as well. And then I'm seeing, you know, will someone else persuade me to think about some things that I read differently. So it's always worthwhile, and I appreciate both of you coming up with this list that I read 9 of. So,
okay.
Oh, well, thank you. It's been really nice having people read them and hear what other people think about them.
Gordon, did you have a favorite from the year?
I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think. Excuse me. As James was saying,
You're
it's
my
been
age,
quite
not
warm,
Gary. Remember,
and now that it's cold,
Oh.
she's miserable.
Oh,
So I'm trying hard to kind of keep her warm and not have her get too affectionate and dig her claws into my clavicle, which she likes doing. I was thinking of Untouched House the other day, and just how dark that was, and
Yeah.
probably thinking more of it. And it's one of those. It's probably more than any other that after finishing doing the monthly discussion, there was so many things I thought, oh, I actually probably could have looked at it that way or this way, or yeah. And yeah, I'm still severely disappointed that I couldn't get to tune in for Panthers in the Museum of Fire, and I will say I really did enjoy actually watching it. It took until about a couple of weeks later before I could watch the recording of it, and still wish I could have been there. But yeah,
Yeah, that was terrific, and it was so generous of Jen to take part.
Yeah.
yes. So I should have thought about that before I tuned in, and actually be able.
I should have prepared. I mean, I just, you know, if someone had to, you know, immediately stop me with a finger in my chest and said what was the best, I would have to say The Endless Summer, just because it was. I think maybe it was one of those. It's like when I was in school, I remember the first day of school, because I changed. My dad was in the military. We moved a number of times, and so I had many first day of school experiences. And then one of them, I was literally in the line before we're supposed to go into classroom with this red-haired, freckled guy, and I just thought, I am going to hate this guy. And he turned out to be my best friend of the year. and uh, and I kind of felt like maybe my reaction to the Endless Summer was that I was so skeptical about what this was going to be like. I do think the marketing blurbs are so off the mark for that book, because it's really just beautiful prose, human insights, and you just, you know, just jump into the stream and float along, and it will take you to some fascinating places. And considering that it's translated, absolutely stunning writing, I think.
Yeah, I think the focusing on the peculiarities, I guess, of the author in that case for marketing purposes, I think, and again, the not brilliant cover, neither of which does it, I think, a lot of favors in terms of finding its audience. But yeah.
Right.
well, it was easy for me to say what it would be for the most favorite, because I made a top 10 list, and I looked through all of my 188 reads, or actually it wasn't 188, but I did it in mid-December, so I'll say 180. And the Alexandra Lund book made my top 10.
Mm.
Because when I look back on it, I was consistently chuckling and wheezing throughout at just the increasing absurdity, and that this person was going to kill themselves for this reason. And there were these strange historic characters that kept popping up. And I thought, this woman is one of the most inventive writers I've ever run across. And two of my friends were like, I've never even heard of this book or this author. And I said, thank you to the Wafer-Thin, all hail to the Wafer-Thin Club for me too.
That was one of James's, and that was a brilliant pick. It was a great, and another example. I mean, it's funny how many of these books have featured sort of verbal repetition and structural repetition as a feature, because that book was rich with these sort of, I'm going to do it, it's going to be the same thing, but it's going to be a little bit different, sort of like a jazz riff on things. And
it actually goes to what you were saying earlier about comedy, in terms of you can put lots of extra information in comedy to add that kind of build up of the kind of delayed gratification of, oh, we're doing this loop again. So yeah.
Well, I didn't want to write this in my introduction for the folks at Slightly Foxed, but it struck me that and we all know people like this, which is, they've perfected their stories, and if you stick around with them long enough, you will hear them virtually verbatim.
Yeah.
They've worked out the timing. It's like a stand-up comedian who doesn't know how to adapt to the evening's audience or something like that. And I mean, all she wrote were memoirs, and it was sort of like, I've got to tell each anecdote just right, as opposed to a fictional writer who can say, well, okay, let's bring in I forget, Einstein. Who comes up? Freud? Take your pick of figures from the early 20th intellectual history. They show up in
somebody's the lover of Hemingway. I remember that one. Poe was in there. It's just every kind of writers that actually did kill themselves, and writers that didn't.
From Antarctica, right?
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I thought it was an apropos. It's a nice quote from the woman who said it, but I have to say, most of my favorite comic books are just completely over the top when they want to go. Okay. Well, any last thoughts? I will mention, if you haven't heard already, so next year's group is skewed to UK time and participation. So unless you want to get up in the middle of the night in Australia, we're going to be doing a month by month read through Anthony Pohl's A Dance to a Music of Time, The Music of Time, which is sort of I actually wanted to had a couple other ideas, but I just didn't think there'd be enough people interested in, and it seems like there's a ton of people who want to read A Dance to the Music of Time, or either read it again. And I joined the Anthony Pohl Society, which will give you more information about Anthony Pohl than perhaps many people desire, but he's got a hardcore fan base. And it is interesting. I first read it in the 80s, so it's a revisit for me, and it's funny how much looks different from the age of 60 something versus 20 something.
Yes, because I read the same. I read it when the TV version came out in the 90s, I think,
which was horrible.
Well, because I started watching it and I thought, this looks as though it could be good if it wasn't so compressed, but you're trying to fit 3 novels into 80 minutes or something. So I gave up on the TV version and read the books instead. But yes, I suspect, because I'm turning 49 tomorrow, so it'll be a little bit of a different perspective now.
Well, and especially Pohl's prose is not condensable. I mean, he is a man of Baroque sentences, and each little scene is kind of like picked over in extraordinary detail. And when you're doing television, you got to do it for plot, especially in that version where it's run, I think it was an hour and a half for 3 novels each.
Yeah. So you whip through 20 years in 20 minutes. It's crazy.
And there's no way you can do justice to the range of the characters he has. And yeah, I just don't think it was well made, but I don't think it could be a decent television series if it wasn't more like 24 hours long.
I'm going to say farewell at this.
Okay.
point,
Well,
and
thank you,
just say
Jordan.
thank
It's
you to
been
both
wonderful
of you.
to meet you and have
Good
your
to meet you.
Yeah, it's been nice seeing you in person, so to speak, Gord.
Yeah, and happy birthday for tomorrow as well.
Yeah, thank
Yes,
you.
happy birthday.
There better be some books I'm getting, I'm hoping. So.
No, James, I'm an early January birthday boy too, and believe me, we always get the slim pickings after Christmas.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, oh I gotta get him something, you know.
Yeah.
Here,
All right.
more
See ya.
socks. Take care, Gordon.
So, yeah.
Well, James, I have to say thank you so much for helping me put this together, and especially your brilliant choices. Your reading range always stuns me with how much you're capable of taking in. Your bandwidth is phenomenal.
Well, thank you. I always say it's because I don't do anything else. So, you know, I haven't achieved anything in life. I can do this.
I mean, I can't imagine what impact it has on your home space, though.
Yeah, well, yeah, as you can see, it's worrying.
It's beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
No, it is.
I think so, but that's a minority opinion in this house. So
I get it. You know, you will get to the point where you start to wonder, is this going to be a mess that my kids have to clean up, or am I going to have the decency to take care of it?
I've already told my daughter it's her problem, and she can do what she wants. I'll be dead, so she can do what she wants. But it'll probably be worth like $3 at that point because no one will read anything.
One of my absolute favorite cartoons. It shows because it's a typical. I don't know if you have this problem quite so in such an extreme as we do in America and Australia, but you know, no one parks their car in a garage in America. At least I've told that people were able to do that, but I don't, you know, I never did it in any of the garages I own because they're full of stuff. And there's a cartoon that shows an old man lifting the door of his garage, and of course it's stuffed to the gill with crap. And his son is standing next to him. He says, "Son, one day all of this will be yours." And having seen the cleaning out of 2 deceased parents' homes, my wife's and mine, yeah, don't do that to your kids. Not that I've gotten around to it. We have 3 garages because we have so much crap from years of moving around.
I was going to say the garage is the one place that I haven't got books, but I realize actually I have. It's just that's where all the old comics have ended up. So there's, you know, piles of comics and graphic novels and crates out there slowly probably decomposing. But
I've never owned a house that had enough space for me to put all my books up on a shelf.
yeah.
Not even the multi-layered approach that you've got going on.
Yeah. Just tell your daughter to open the doors and just have a multi-day sale and say, you know, the wafer-thin books are this small price and the medium ones are 3 prices, and they'll clear them out and people will be very happy, and we can hoist one in your honor. So I think it's fine. Just hang on to them. So
this is my plan. I have to say my father-in-law died last year, and he had an extensive wine collection, and that was a lot more popular with people afterwards. So people want to get their hands on those. So
I would think so.
I had one of the things I had to do is dispose of my father's alcohol collection, and in general, his taste in alcohol, wine, etc., was abominable. So, so there were many bottles that got poured down the drain, and it was, yeah, I mean, cherry wines from the 70s or something.
Probably mostly sediment, some of them.
Oh yeah, there was a great deal of sediment.
Well, these were there's very, in this case, some nice wines. So my wife's inheritance is some nice wines and a lot of 5 1/4 inch discs. Those old floppy discs.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
They'll keep you
items,
for hours and hours.
Yeah.
As you hear them swishing in the drive.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, later this year, I'm going to do as a newly minted retiree at my local branch. I am going to do a literature and translation book discussions for 6 of them. So I may hit you both up with my list. See about
try
suggestions.
And stop me.
So at least 2 or 3 of them will have to be wafer thin, so people don't feel like they're reading too many things. But like June through November, so that should be a lot of fun.
There's the guy to talk to, not me, because I'm afraid. I mean, I quickly realized that if I wanted to have a reading group about neglected books, it would be me and and the wall, because people, it really makes such a huge difference to be able to get the book in one click. I mean, it's a step function in terms of readership.
Well, there's the number of books on neglected books that I've got sitting in various shopping carts, just waiting for them to show up with the books often I can afford. But there'll be these bastards who sell you like a $10 secondhand paperback, but they'll say, "Oh yeah, postage to Australia, that's $60," and you think, "You asshole." Yeah. So yeah,
absolutely. Except there are some stores in Australia that seem to have amazing caches of British books, at least into the 60s, British fiction. But then you have to pay $35 to get it shipped to the United States.
Yeah.
So yeah. But there was something else I was going to mention. Shoot, I just went blank. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, that's the thing. Neglected books. So, I guess I was mentioning. So James, our little trick with the Internet Archive, I think may be a thing of the past.
Oh no!
It appears that what they are doing is rebuilding using what they call LCP PDF. And essentially it's a much higher grade of encryption.
Bugger.
But you can borrow them. So there's a reader called Thorium, which you can download, at least for Windows and Mac. You can borrow them, and it works the same way as a borrow. If it's available for borrow, you can work, but the sort of and their loan policy does keep the book open as long as you're like actively reading it. So if you read it over the course of a few days, you can. But of course, it's much more difficult to take notes. That's what I always liked, was the ability to highlight sections and keep them and go back to them. And you don't have that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I don't think we're going to see. So the old school was called ACSM file formats. I think they're using this as an opportunity to phase that out, or not ever bring it back.
Another golden age over.
Yeah, exactly. Great regrets, but it was wonderful while it lasted.
Yeah, true. I can't say I haven't scored like hundreds and hundreds of books through using it. So, yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. It's been fascinating. I have certainly gotten exposed to a bunch of different things that I was not familiar with and have definitely appreciated. So thank you, James, for your the range of your reading has been a wonderful contribution, and it's been great to have these discussions.